welcome. Today I'm going to be speaking to Emma Jane Taylor, who has been described as courageous, inspirational, determined, influential and strong. So very much looking forward to finding out what makes Emma Jane Taylor tick. She's a motivational speaker, a corporate behaviour change trainer and mentor, and more specifically and more recently has become an ardent campaigner for survivors of child sex abuse. Now, clearly, this is a topic I'm not so familiar with, and so it can bring up difficult conversations. And at the end of this interview, for those of you that are listening, if it brings up any issues for you, we'll be providing a support page for you to click on to find out more. So, Emma, welcome today. You're also a TEDx speaker, an author of your autobiography on the experiences you went through called Don't Hold Back. So where do we start? Let's start by your mission. What is it you're trying to achieve and what drives you to achieve it?
Thank you, Annabelle, and thank you for inviting me along today. I want to put the survivors' voices back in the heart of this conversation of child sex abuse. There's too much conversation and emphasis on the perpetrators. I totally believe they need to be rehabbed. But we need to change the conversation back to the reality, and that is child sex abuse rips lives apart from the victim through to the victim's families, and they don't really ever get that opportunity to speak up, speak out. They might get some therapy, they might get a little bit of support for an amount of time, but this isn't a short-term window. This is a life-damaging experience. It goes through so many hoops of fire and rips worlds apart. As a child, you're developing as your body and your brain allows you to, and it's not until you're in your late 20s that you really do understand what's happened to you as a child, and then there's an amount of years that just get lost, and then the struggles really start. So I want to get this conversation back into the heart of survivors. Get the voices back into this conversation, because we need to remind everybody that this is a reality happening to so many people across the world, and it could happen to anyone today.
Okay, so in your TEDx talk, you entitled "It's Not Just the Strangers We Should Be Careful Of." You say strangers are only a tiny proportion of the risk to children. So what's the bigger picture when it comes to child sex abuse?
You know, we educate, and I don't know about you, in my TEDx talk, you might have seen, but, you know, when I was a young girl, I was terrified of the man in the white van. And in many ways, I still am. No offense to white van drivers, but that was my education, strangers. But the reality was that it was someone much closer to my life that sexually abused me as a child. And I want to change this conversation. Yes, of course, we need to be aware of stranger danger, but the reality is that most children being sexually abused are being abused by someone they know, and the stats for that is around 90%. Yet we are educating 10%. So there is just no sensible balance with this conversation. It's a very taboo subject. People don't want to talk about it, but I do, and we need to get much more into schools, into safeguarding. This isn't about scaring children of their loved ones. It's helping children understand what's appropriate, what isn't, what's trust, what isn't, and understanding what healthy relationships are. So yeah, it's that kind of, that's the lead with that TED talk, is really sort of change the dynamic of the conversation so that we can start thinking differently about child sex abuse. And it's not the man in the white van or, you know, whoever else. You know, I was always scared to walk through a woods on my own because of it. And I'm not saying that's a sensible thing for any woman on their own to do at night or anything, but, you know, it's about the realities.
Okay. And then in the business context, how important do you think it is for business leaders to be aware of the potential impact on those that have suffered child sex abuse and how that might manifest in terms of mental health issues in the workplace?
So, you know, for many, the resultant mental trauma for child sex abuse is like being in prison. So for years and years of development of children into their young teens, into their 20s, they're still developing, their brains are still developing. And so when they get to their 20s, that's when they are understanding more about their childhood. That's when their world can come crashing down. And of course, this is in a time of their life that they should be flourishing. This is in a prime of their life where they should be going into work, into business, into, the profession that they'd worked so hard for as a young person. But they're crippled emotionally at this point. So they're suppressed. So maybe they just don't achieve what they should achieve because they don't know what they're dealing with their mental health. And it's an interesting conversation to have, actually, because I recently put something on Twitter saying, do you think that you would have had the mental health difficulties you'd had if you hadn't been sexually abused? And everyone said no, probably wouldn't have done. Although some said they would. Would I have gone through my difficulties if I hadn't gone through sexual abuse? Absolutely not. I do truly believe that. I've been able to sort of find my way through therapy and talking about it, but so many people can't. So, talented survivors then circle around a life of silence and fear because they are just ashamed of what has happened to them. And we need to allow this conversation some air now so that we can increase productivity and success for many survivors struggling in silence. So I do have a petition with Parliament at the moment because I really do feel the government must fund specialist schemes to provide more support for survivors than is currently available, and also to help them get back into the workplace. And we also need the corporates to start leaning into these conversations. So I have started talking to corporates about this and how important it is just to understand this conversation. And mental health is really, really important. But what's the trigger? Is there a trigger? And what do you know about that? That's, we don't need everyone to put their hand up and say that they're a survivor of child sex abuse, but we need to be more understanding, have more empathy and listening ears to this.
Gosh, this is, a really interesting area. So what's your approach to educating and empowering children, if we start with the children's side and then coming on to teachers and others involved in childcare? What's the Emma Jane Taylor methodology?
For children, it's about healthy relationships. It's simply understanding what's appropriate, what isn't, what's trust, what isn't, what's respect, how to speak to your peers, how to have a relationship with adults, and understanding your body. So, I've done a lot of poetry around this for different ages as well, because it's all it has to be age appropriate training. I'm absolutely not interested in going to speak to kids to say, by the way, you need to be careful of your loved ones. It's not, that conversation is not appropriate at all in any life. What we need to do is, like I say, age-related education, helping children understand what's healthy and what isn't. So from the children's point of view, it's about nourishing them. At the moment, there's a lot of pressure on teenagers to lose their virginity. There's a lot of pressure on teenagers to be like the Instagram picture, so early sexualizing young people. So it's bringing that back. Now that's a task and a half because, the online world is huge. So it's just giving another conversation and dynamic to what's happening in the world to help people think a little bit more differently. From the safeguarding point of view, it's, it's not that I'm teaching people to suck eggs because, we all know what we should be doing, but there's not enough time in the school hours for teachers to really, I think, invest in this conversation. They do PHSE. Personally, I think a lot of that is a tick box. And I think we need to have more consistent messages shared throughout the education system so that the teachers, the safeguarding teams can, push that down. So whilst you are educating the kids, once a month, every week, you have some gentle reminders from the safeguarding and adults in that teaching environment that can help educate children. And then when you're doing that, you then look at the potential red flags, potential possibilities of someone being abused. And they might not be being abused, they might be being bullied, they might be going through some peer-to-peer pressure, but there are definitely things that you could be looking out for that could make a difference to this conversation.
Yeah, so the telltale signs, what might someone, a teacher or a business leader looking at an employee who's gone through this, what would the two sides of that be? So from the child perspective and the adult perspective?
So if I look at myself in this conversation, I think you could look at, I was still bedwetting as into sort of like 12-year-old really. Now that was very late. I was very nervous. I was very shaky. I used to get quite embarrassed. I became quite nauseous. I became scared to do anything and put my hand up for anything. And so, if you looked at me as a child, I was definitely very, very uncertain. And I'd gone from, I'd say, a relatively confident young girl to suddenly very insecure, very vulnerable, very volatile. I became quite aggressive and became very addicted to drinking, smoking, all the other naughty substances. I started to develop OCD traits, paranoia, and started to scrub myself in the bath every night. So there were little things now that seem obvious, but at the time they wouldn't have seemed obvious, because certainly I was born in the 1970s and we just didn't have these conversations, so it wasn't so highlighted. But those are things that you could look out for. In adults, it could be anything from, I used to have maladaptive daydreaming, just meant that I just went into this world of my own. And I would occasionally be triggered, and I could tend to get I could be quite anxious about something that was maybe quite minor, but it could be that it just triggered me to a thought process that I didn't even know what that meant. So it could be that. Obviously I was still drinking, and I was still very erratic with my behaviour, and I was bulimic. So those were things. Now that's not to suggest that you could be a victim or survivor of child sex abuse, but definitely consideration should be given to someone who has all sorts of difficulties in behaving as you might see as normal in the workplace.
That's a really fantastic spectrum of telltale signs to have shared. Thank you so much for being so candid and honest about those. That brings me on to how you've changed things around. Clearly you've had lots of support along the way to become the woman you are today. And the 90-10 project, which I imagine harks back to the 90% that you mentioned earlier in the interview. So how does that fit into your strategy? You're swimming the English Channel, skydiving, shark swimming. Tell me more about the project and the hopes and ambitions for that.
Yeah, so I have been working with a team over the last year on, where I was in the world, what I was doing, what I was achieving from a professional point, and what I was achieving with my advocacy work. And I really wanted to do more in this space. And I wanted to bring about awareness and conversations, engage people on the conversation of child sex abuse. So Project 90-10, kind of a seed was sown in 2021. A team has grown with the seed, and we're in the embryonic stages of setting up the charity. And it's really focused on giving young people and parents the right tools through education, raising awareness, sharing knowledge on the subject of child sex abuse and what needs to be done to reduce that crime. The work we're doing ensures that young people in the generations to follow are armed with necessary skills in life to ensure a positive change in the statistics around this topic. So we kind of started, that was our sort of like real mission and, what we wanted to achieve. And I thought, obviously we need to do some fundraising, to do some awareness. What am I going to do? And I thought, well, actually, the only thing to do is just to get out there. No one's going to hear you unless you get out there. And from the sheer fact that most survivors are silenced, so not many people want to speak up about it, but I do. So I decided that was it. I was going to do a year of challenges, and that started in September. So I've done, like you say, swum the English Channel virtually. I've done a 12-hour fitness-a-thon. I've done a half marathon walk in silence, which is quite hard. I've done the London 10 Peaks challenge. I've done a 10-mile paddleboard along the Thames. I've just come back from a 100k Jurassic Coast walk. I've got a 70-mile round the Isle of Wight walk, and my last challenge is going to be a wing walk, which doesn't appeal in the slightest to me. It makes me feel sick even just thinking about it, even just saying it. But, unless I'm out there putting a voice, I just don't feel like I can do awareness for Project 9010 and the work that we're doing. So you just, this isn't something that's going to be an overnight and aware, but no one's going to know about it overnight. We've got to be at it consistently, showing up. And here we are at month 9. And I would say, we're starting to get a lot more interest from a lot of people. So that's just can only be a good thing.
Well, you've certainly done a tremendous amount to raise the profile. I understand you've been recognised by the United Nations in a speech by the Peace Ambassador Kimberly Kletcher. I'm not sure of the pronunciation. Kletcher, who announced that you are a woman who strives to make the world a better place, which is phenomenal recognition. So congratulations on that. And only at month 9, you're doing a great job there. I'm interested. I mean, you've mentioned quite a few of the stakeholders, but who are you trying to influence, and what are the sort of blocks and challenges you're encountering? If you could unblock that, what would good look like?
I think, like I say at the beginning, I want to put survivors' voices back at the heart of this conversation. That would be one of my first things. The second thing is to tackle the government, because we've got Boris Johnson in 2019 on LBC saying, investigating historic child sex abuser cases is spaffing money up the wall. Now, that does no good for this conversation, and it was reported in The Guardian, and it just really, really stops people from speaking up. If you've got a leader saying this is just not even worth it. You've got politicians. We've recently seen Khan be sent. He's just about to be sentenced for his sex offence cases. Crispin Blunt MP supported him, a sex offender, and recently we're just in another Conservatory MP being charged with rape. So we need to go to the leaders. We need to get up there. Yes, it's great we're having this conversation. It's great that I speak to survivors. It's great that I'm interviewed as I am, on the scale I am. But we need change from the top. Priti Patel has recently put out her strategy in 2021 for tackling child sex abuse, which is great. But what's happening? Nothing. We need to get people much more active and engaged in the realities and what needs to change, and not just keep pushing this away, hoping that everyone's going to be fine, because they're not. I see just a catalogue of disaster following child sex abuse. And that's where I really do believe we need to go now, is right, go to the leaders, go to the government, get some more influence from the top on this conversation.
We haven't talked about this because in our pre-chat before the interview, I didn't think about whether you look at this at a global level or is this purely a UK focus? Because have you looked at the cultural differences between how leaders in other countries approach?
Yes, and obviously, from where we are at the moment, I would say we have to start in the UK, because this is where we are, and localized. Actually, you've got to start in local counties to start with as you start developing this conversation. If you look at overseas and global, yes, of course, this conversation affects children across the world. But in some countries, you're up against completely different morals and beliefs and consent. Some countries some countries children consent to have sex is 9 years old. That's just a green light for child sex abuse. So, they're not going to entertain me coming out there, because I'm sure they'd probably throw stones at me, because that's not how they are educated and living in their culture. So I do not agree that consent should be anything less than 16. I personally would like to see it pushed to 18, because I think children need to do way more developing than they are. But if we're going to accept 16, so be it. But we need to educate the kids. Taking it any younger, for me, is a crime in itself.
How do you continue to grow and develop as a personal leader? I expect the challenges you're undertaking are particularly developing in certain ways, but any other ways that you would say that you're growing and developing?
Yeah, I mean, every day I am speaking to more people, significant people. I've recently been speaking to MPs. Today I'm speaking to the House of Commons. At the weekend I'm going to be on GB News. Every day I'm being given new opportunities to share the work that I'm doing. I'm also, and I think this is really important for anyone in this space of child sex abuse, speaking out. I've had years and years and years and years of therapy to be here in this position. I don't advise anyone to speak out unless you have a good support system around you, because it can be absolutely crippling speaking out and then taking this conversation forward. I come up against resilience, sadly, because you do nowadays with the online world. So I grow with the people around me. So I grow with survivors, and they've become so important and entrenched in my life. I have a great team around me. I have a good support system around me, with the work that I do professionally and also the work I do with my advocacy work. So how do I grow? I grow and develop through real voices, through listening to my team, to listening to people who have positive opinion to share on this conversation, not Boris Johnson spaffing money up a wall. I don't want to listen to that. That's not helpful. We need to listen to someone saying, look, we need to really put the survivors' voices back at the heart of this conversation, because they are what matters. I've been speaking to 80-year-old women who are disclosing to me for the first time. That's sad. I just recently written an article for a magazine about a baby who was sexually abused, and the abuser has gone into prison now. In 27 years, that baby will be 27, but the baby still has a whole life ahead, because that's so complex. So I want that survivor to be thought of, not the perpetrator.
It sounds like you have built an incredible team around you, which I'm always inspired by, because I think if you surround yourself by great people, it can take you further than you can imagine.
Oh, do you know what? I always say I work with people far more talented than me.
And then beyond your immediate team, who do you look to for inspiration or mentorship, if at all?
I have great friends. I have a couple of people who I worked with in the early part of my life when I was just starting out, who were, I'd say, tough bosses, who I hated, but I love them now, because I can pick up the phone and just say, hey, this is happening, that's happening, what do you think? And they give me straight down the line advice. I don't have anyone, there's no one fussing around me. They're very honest with me. And that's really all I can ask for from my network, from my professional team, from my mentors. So yes, I do have a few mentors. And I lean on the people that I know that I need to for honest, good advice. Sometimes they say, EJ, that's just not a good idea. And then I weigh it up with my team, and we come to a decision.
Excellent. I know you're very busy. I know you're heading off to the House of Commons this afternoon. What will good look like if you're successful in your mission in the coming 5 to 10 years? Can you paint a picture for me?
Well, I'd love in the next 5 to 10 years that we are having open conversations. We are supporting survivors. There's better funding available to support survivors back into work in the workplace. I would love to see the corporate world much more leaned into this conversation and understanding that what it might look like for a survivor of child sex abuse, and to have just an open platform like we have now for mental health, but have that for child sex abuse, because that would be just my biggest delight to get that conversation move forward. And I'd also like to see the education in schools progressing and developing, so this is a reality for schools, safeguarding teens, education. But I'd also really like to see in schools better education, and this goes slightly off grain here, but better education on social media and how to use current technology, because I just don't see that, and we really need that.
Thank you. I did say at the beginning that if anybody's listening to this interview and has been affected by the issues that we've been discussing, to look up your help and resource page on your website. So that'll be emmajanetaylor.com/help-and-support, and we'll put that at the bottom of the video. But thank you so much for your time today, Emma J. I hope that you've covered off all the messages that you wanted to share with me. It's been a really deep and interesting conversation, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annabelle. It's been great to have this conversation with you. Thank you.